Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, the second annual One Harvard Lectures That Last. I'm Chris from Harvard Divinity School and I'll be your MC. Tonight we've come together from across the university for this interdisciplinary event to celebrate the wide range of experiences and interests in our graduate community and promote the cross-pollination of ideas. This is, I want to remind you, an entirely student-run event brought to you by the Harvard Graduate Council, because we, as students, want to create an environment where we can share ideas. Harvard University seeks to produce the next generation of leaders in our respective fields, and many of us do, in fact, hope to become leaders in our fields. But the truth about the world is that it isn't neatly divided into fields. Much of our work will quite naturally and necessarily be interdisciplinary. Recognizing that creativity and innovation often spring from exchanging ideas and applying concepts from one discipline to another, we seek to foster both interdisciplinary and interpersonal connections within this diverse graduate community. We have a great lineup of speakers for you tonight, featuring Charles Willey as our keynote, and one student-nominated professor from each of the 12 Harvard graduate schools who was selected by the student population at that school, thought to be most representative and the best representative for that school. So it's pretty exciting. We'll also have a few performances sprinkled in throughout the program for you, as well as 2 raffles, one before intermission and one at the very end of the evening, so make sure you stay for that. I hope you also got a chance to check out the student artwork in the gallery to your right. If you haven't gotten a chance to do that yet, I hope you will at some point during the program tonight, during intermission or at the end, since it's all student work as well, and it's quite beautiful. By blending the artistic and academic tonight, we hope to inspire continuous stimulation, engagement, reflection, and creative thinking. We also hope tonight's program will give you a lot to talk about with your peers from across the university and spark some conversations. We'd love for you to stretch your mind and make some new friends tonight. At this time, I'd like to thank everyone who helped plan this event, especially the chair of the planning committee, Biba Matthew. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Harvard University Employees Credit Union, Citibank, Brattle Street Florist, and Obon Pan for making this event possible. Now, first, we'll have a few words of welcome from Reverend Jonathan Walton, whose sanctuary we find ourselves in. In addition to being the Pusey Minister of Memorial Church, Reverend Walton is a professor of Christian morals with the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and a professor of religion and society at Harvard Divinity School.
Good evening. You can do better than that. Good evening. We would like to welcome you here to the Memorial Church on tonight. As she just said, I am Professor Jonathan L. Walton, the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister right here in the Memorial Church. And we greet you, all of your beautiful faces on this evening. We have a saying here at the Memorial Church, at Mem Church. Everyone may not belong to Mem Church, but Mem Church belongs to everyone at Harvard. That is to say, what we do on Sunday morning may not be your cup of tea. Yes, we are a place of interdenominational Christian worship on Sunday morning, but we are also a laboratory of learning and a site of critical engagement 7 days a week. And that is why we are so glad to welcome all of you here tonight, as we understand that we make up this beautiful community called Harvard University. We believe in One Harvard here at Mem Church, for we believe in President Faust's vision. It's not just a catchy slogan. It's not just a saying for us. And this is not to say that we are trying to sweep our differences and our beautiful distinctions up under the throw rug of sameness. No, not at all. But we believe that we are a part of a beautiful patchwork that makes up this great quilt of Harvard University. So no matter whether you're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Jewish, agnostic, or atheist, no matter whether you are a historian, a scholar of religion, a biologist, a chemist, a scholar of business, no matter what you are, no matter who you are, we welcome you here tonight as we are here to extend what we believe to be our mission at the Memorial Church: educating minds, expanding hearts, and thus enriching lives. Welcome. Enjoy yourself on this evening.
Now it's time for our keynote speaker, Charles Willey, Professor Emeritus of Education. Professor Willey has written 30 books, 30, including The Ivory and Ebony Towers, Black Students at White Colleges, The Black College Mystique, and African Americans and the Doctoral Experience. These books analyze the experiences of Black students at predominantly white schools and the experience of white students in predominantly Black schools in the United States. Professor Willey served as an expert witness in major school desegregation cases across the nation, from our very own Boston to far-flung Seattle and a whole bunch of other places in between. He's also served as the vice president of the American Sociological Association. Most of his research focuses on desegregation, higher education, public health, race relations, and urban community problems. For this reason, he considers himself an applied sociologist concerned with solving social problems. Tonight, he's going to tell us about the benefits of diversity for graduate schools.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me to be here with my colleagues, my young colleagues, for a wonderful, wonderful gathering. It's with pleasure that I accept this invitation to be your keynote speaker to this wonderful gathering of scholars who are wise enough to give as well as receive important information from their colleagues who are affiliated with the Harvard Graduate Council. The theme of my speech will deal with the benefits of diversity in graduate schools. I begin with a quotation from Benjamin Elijah Mays, president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when Martin Luther King Jr. and I were enrolled in that school as freshmen, which was back in 1944. Our college president, Dr. Mays, said, "No one is wise enough, rich enough, or strong enough to go it alone. Whether you are first year or whether you are a graduate school person, we all stand in the need of help. Therefore, we praise the Harvard Graduate Council for convening this set of evening lectures. You are creating what Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, would call a society composed of cooperating individuals devoted to the pursuit of sanity. It is good to be with sane people today. As you know, each speaker has been asked to talk about a concept that he or she is examining and its implications for others. Diversity is implication for others and for ourselves, the concept that I would like to select to discuss for a few minutes. The famous historian John Hope Franklin, who earned a PhD degree in history from Harvard University many years ago, said that perhaps no question in the United States in the 20th century aroused more interest at home and abroad as the debate about the need for racial diversity in educational institutions. In his book titled Culture Out of Anarchy, The Reconstruction of American Higher Education, Judson Jerome, an educator, asked why the academy is so preoccupied with standards, a word implying conformity on the one hand and hierarchy on the other. This is a difficult question if one also understands education to be means to liberation. Clifton Wharton, Jr., another educator, tells us that the long-standing elitist pattern of higher education, whether based on socioeconomic factors of birth or intellectual attainment, is crumbling. Another educator, Daniel Levinson, tells us that the experience of achieving success is always based to some degree on an illusion, such as this phrase: quality is the opposite of quantity, and that a society with an excellent system of higher education cannot have both quality and quantity. My belief is that educated people should be good enough to help, not harm, others. Levinson further said that the Faust story is a classical portrayal of the man at midlife making a last desperate effort to achieve the desperate effort for achievement by selling his soul to the devil. May I call your attention to my classmate, Martin Luther King, Jr., when he graduated from Morehouse College, and he had a grade point average of 2.5, halfway between B and C. His grade in one of the courses on public speaking in the seminary he attended as a graduate student was C. Nevertheless, he became a good scholar, good enough to be one of the nation's best orators. So may I close this speech with a few lines from a special advertisement, a statement that Harvard University placed in Fortune magazine about a decade ago. And I read you this because it will tell you why I was talking about how important it is to have others who are not like oneself. And this is what Harvard told the country through Fortune magazine. I quote it: "At a time when our communities, our workplaces, and our markets are becoming more diverse, it is more important than ever that education brings together students, faculty, and staff from a wide range of groups. At Harvard University," the statement goes on, it is essential to devote ourselves to openness and opportunities for all, and varying prospects that enhance learning and working is what we want to do here at Harvard. And I was pleased that this was what Harvard was telling the rest of the community, because I knew it would have to be that themselves. So this is my challenge. You must do whatever you can to help the university continue to fulfill its goal of diversity. Briefly, I'll tell you what I did to help Harvard continue to increase its goal of diversity. I accepted the office of co-president of the Association of Black Faculty and Staff. Rather than accusing the administration, I obtained the report that the university had to file with the federal government each year regarding the number of teachers in minority groups in each department and in each school. I and my colleagues computed the number of teachers in each development, in each department, and in each school, and prepared news releases for the campus newspaper. We compared the number of several years, then we invited each dean to be our guests in a morning breakfast. I'm here telling you what we did. And before going to see the deans to talk with them, we told the president what we were going to do. And we said, we've come here to tell you that we want to talk with all of the deans in this school so that we can say we will help you if you cannot find good scholars among minorities. But before meeting the deans, the co-president of our organization arranged to meet with the president, as I said, and the president was pleased that we were doing what we were planning to do. And so we had a breakfast with each dean. I might say we paid for it because deans like to pay for it. And we told them that we were here not to harass him, but we are here to work with you. And having seen the president before we saw the deans, and having talked to the deans, telling them we would help, we were able to help this wonderful school have more and more people who are minorities. So I'll close this by also telling you what I'm doing now, and it will be short. I am now trying to develop a program of junior year, not overseas, but junior year of white students in black colleges. And I've been trying to find the money to give scholarships to the white students who will go to black schools for a semester. I've talked with black presidents about it, and they are excited. And so that's the mission. I'm in that kind of thing to make good what we are trying to do at Harvard. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce one of our talented performers. As a flautist, Ainsley Land of Harvard Divinity School sometimes flouts the law, but tonight she'll be playing the flute for us. That was lovely, Ainsley. Thank you so much. Now we'll hear from one of our student-nominated professors from each of the 12 Harvard graduate schools, starting with Richard Parker from the Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Parker is an Oxford-trained economist who's taught at the Kennedy School now for over 2 decades, and twice been named Teacher of the Year. He co-founded Mother Jones and is currently the chair of the editorial board at The Nation, so if you're a fan of those magazines, you have him to thank. He grew Greenpeace from 2,000 to 700,000 members, and since that wasn't enough for him, he also launched People for the American Way. He served as senior advisor to Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou during the height of the Greek economic crisis and has worked with a number of US senators, including Ted Kennedy. Tonight, he'll be giving a talk entitled, Why Doubt is the Heart of Faith, and Why We Should All Be Faithful Doubters.
You're an interesting generation in American historical terms because if Pew's survey data is right, you're the least religious, or at least the least religiously affiliated generation in American history. That interests me because I think a lot of you approach the idea of faith from a posture of doubt and think that somehow faith and doubt are counterpoised, when what I want to do is argue tonight that true faith involves doubt at every turn. It's important to understand where I come from in terms of faith. My Jewish wife calls me one of God's frozen people. That means I'm an Episcopalian. You know us. You know why there are never any Episcopalians at an orgy, because there are too many thank you notes the next morning to write. And you know how to spot the bride at an Episcopal wedding, I'll bet, too, because she's always the one kissing the golden retriever. It's important for me also to say that I'm a survivor of organized religion, not in the sense that I was physically or sexually abused, but in the sense, in the fact that my father was an Episcopal clergyman for 52 years. And for any of you who've been a preacher's kid or know a preacher's kid, you understand that faith is not a matter of choice when you're growing up, any more than good manners. Somewhere in a box stuffed away, I have 14 years of perfect attendance pins for Sunday school. I was an acolyte for 10 years, a member of the choir for 12. I was even an Eagle Scout in the church's scout troop, as if all that weren't enough. And then, of course, like so many preachers' kids, so many perhaps of you, densely drenched in a choice, not in a choice, but in a faith of someone else's choosing, I walked away from religion. Not for a year or two when I went off to college, but for nearly 2 decades. I didn't set foot in a church, never thought about church or religion. And it wasn't until the mid-1980s, after I'd launched Mother Jones and was traveling something like 150,000 to 200,000 miles a year for Greenpeace, that religion came back into my life. It came back in not because I was looking for it, but because it found me. It was a tough period in my life, despite outward success. I'd gone through a divorce, I was drinking too much, I was very unhappy inside. I lived a life of hollow success. The outward signs were there, but nothing gave me pleasure at any deep level. And I kept an apartment in New York City when I traveled on the East Coast. And what I remember is one spring going running on a Sunday morning to shake out the excesses of a Saturday night. And at a certain point, stopping because I heard hymns. And I recognized the hymns. And sure enough, I was standing outside St. Mark's in the Bowery, a lovely old Episcopal church in the Lower East Side of New York. And I stood for a few minutes and listened through the open windows to the hymns on that lovely spring day. And then, as luck would have it, a few weeks later, I was out running on another Sunday when I was in New York, and guess where I ended up? Almost by accident. And to shorten a long story, about a year after I first started listening to hymns outside St. Mark's in the Bowery, I found myself sitting inside St. Mark's in the Bowery. And for a year, quietly sat in the back, not participating in the service, simply sitting and listening to the old hymns and the old prayers. I didn't want to belong to a faith, and yet I couldn't walk away from the idea of community that the faith offered. The moment of transition came for me when one morning the rector stood and invited a very ill young man to come and stand next to him. Remember, this was the early 80s, when AIDS was thought to be something that might be an infectious disease, and people feared to touch someone who was HIV positive, or even in many cases get close. People who had AIDS were not supposed to be teachers, they were not supposed to be involved in public service. They were isolated in every sense of the word by a society that had no understanding but had enormous fear of the disease. And the rector said that this young man had AIDS and was going to die. And he had asked for one thing, which was the blessing of the congregation on him. And the rector said, "Will those of you who wish to give him your blessing come forward?" And you know what? The entire congregation stood and walked forward and held him in a circle for more than 5 minutes. It was at that moment that I understood that faith is about kindness and kinship, but it should never be about the confidence that we know exactly who God is or what she intends for us. Faith is a condition of openness, and doubt is a condition of openness to faith. What you want to do when you approach the question of faith is not pose doubt as its antithesis, but rather embrace the idea that in doubting, we can come to believe in something deeper. W.H. Auden once said that he had never seen God, but thought he had heard his voice once or twice. I like that as a description of what faith means. It's an opportunity to connect not only to the world around us, but to understand that life as it proceeds through us, proceeds then on through the lives of others, billions of others, quite different, quite distinct, quite diverse. A world that we may never know, but a world of which we can also be part through a combination of faith and doubt. When my father died, I found among his papers a little card on which he'd typed out the words of Reinhold Niebuhr. "Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime, therefore we must be saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes sense in any immediate context of history, therefore we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, therefore we must be saved by love." Thank you.
That was great, wasn't it? I'm at the Divinity School studying this stuff. I loved that. Now we'll hear from Deborah Anker from Harvard Law School. Dr. Anker is the director of the Harvard Law School Immigration and Refugee Clinical Program. She is one of the most widely known asylum scholars and practitioners in the United States, and her work has created a foundation for clinics at law schools across the country. In addition to teaching the immigration and refugee law seminar at the law school, Anker has developed an innovative cross-disciplinary course called Immigration, Law, Policy, and Social Change. That's something you could check out. It's available to all students from across the university, and students from all the different graduate schools have participated in. And tonight, her talk is going to be called Legal Change from the Bottom Up, the Story of Gender Asylum in the United States.
Just imagine you are Isabella, a strong and independent woman growing up in your native country of Honduras. You've worked since the age of 6 helping your mother, who struggled in poverty, selling tortillas in the local market. You studied hard and you excelled in school. One day, when you are 13 years old, you are attacked by Jorge, a suitor of your sister, who drags you into a hotel room and brutally rapes you. Your whole world changes. He continues to stalk you for years, kidnapping, beating, and raping you, because in his words, you are my woman and I own you. You have his child. Despite all this, you work hard and become a successful and well-respected manager at a local retail store. You believe that women have the right to equality and freedom from abuse. Through a series of extraordinary circumstances, you finally find the means to flee your country. You are a refugee. You are in need of protection. The International Refugee Convention requires countries to provide protection to people fleeing serious human rights abuses based on their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. The United States implemented the Refugee Convention in 1980. Nonetheless, 20 years ago, no one would have recognized Isabella's claim for protection and status, despite her courage, despite her need. But 3 months ago, our immigration clinic, won asylum for Isabella. Something remarkable happened in the interim. Our clinic, along with other advocates and colleagues around the world, fought for decision makers to recognize asylum claims based on gender, awarding asylum protection and providing safe haven to thousands of women in the United States. We created the body of law called Gender Asylum. International refugee law has transformed over the past 30 years, and Gender Asylum has not only been a beneficiary of this change, it has acted as a major catalyst for it. When we think of legal change, we usually think of change from the top down. We think of changes that result from new laws or federal court or even Supreme Court decisions. Gender Asylum, however, tells a different story. By bringing cases and presenting arguments before low-level decision makers such as immigration judges and asylum officers, we change the thinking of adjudicators and institutional cultures, laying the foundation for changes, some yet to come, at higher administrative and federal court levels. 20 years ago, harms like domestic violence and female genital mutilation that disproportionately affect women were relegated to the private sphere, such that even rape was not generally understood as a serious human rights violation in the asylum context. Indeed, all but one of the early asylum decisions in the US involved claims by men. This led us to ask the question, where are the women? In the early 1990s, our clinics and other asylum and refugee lawyers advocated for US courts to recognize gender violence as persecution and feminism as a political opinion meriting asylum. In 1993, a federal court case denied asylum to an Iranian woman who refused to wear the chador. Our clinic filed a friend of the court brief to support her claim, and undeterred by the negative outcome, we seized the opportunity to draw on strong language buried in the decision that feminism could constitute a political opinion, and women who are being subjected to serious abuse because of their gender deserve protection. We used the language of the court's decision to create a basis for our future cases, laying the groundwork for asylum for thousands of women. That same year, 1993, following the first coup against Haitian President Aristide, we began representing many Haitians seeking asylum protection in the United States. In 1995, our clinic joined with the Center for Constitutional Rights to interview and gather affidavits from Haitian women, including our clients, who were being systematically raped and beaten in retaliation for their actual and presumed political beliefs. We submitted a report to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which then recognized that rape constitutes torture. This was the first recognition of rape as torture by an international human rights body. Through our proactive advocacy and collaboration with interested NGOs and government officials, we succeeded in getting the United States to issue gender asylum guidelines in 1995, making the US the second country in the world to do so. These guidelines, drafted by our clinic, were issued with the goal of assisting U.S. adjudicators in evaluating refugee claims by women based on their gender. Before the guidelines were issued, we worked with female journalists to highlight the fairness and equity issues at stake. The New York Times and other major publications ran numerous articles telling the stories of our refugee clients. In the early 1990s and early 2000s, because of our work and growing advocacy internationally, courts around the world in Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand issued decisions focusing on the failure of countries to protect women from gender-based violence. Then a lightning rod case in 1999 complicated the landscape, matter of RA, where the Board of Immigration Appeals denied asylum to a Guatemalan woman, Rodi Alvarado, who was fleeing a very violent and abusive relationship. Our clinic organized nearly 200 groups and individuals to argue that the decision be vacated, and we succeeded, but the case still festered, undecided for a decade. Finally, in 2009, Rodi Alvarado won asylum. She became one of the women who now can start a new life safe in the United States. But the decision came with no explanation and only applied to her, not any of the other thousands of women whose claims were on hold. For 10 years, while Rodi Alvarado's case was left undecided, our clinic continued to bring case after case for women seeking asylum in the U.S. based on their gender and their feminist opinions, among other grounds. We were winning these cases and helping to shape the development of the law at the lower levels by using creative legal arguments. Case by case, we pieced together seemingly inconsequential language from court decisions, government legal briefs, and memoranda in international law, and created compelling legal arguments to persuade adjudicators that these women met the requirements of the law. In response to our victories, we saw the government changing its position in individual cases across the country, recognizing, for example, domestic violence as a basis for asylum. But mostly it was our clients' courageous testimony in their own voices that won over the adjudicators and changed the legal landscape. This shows how with advocacy, even a single statement in an individual case can have persuasive power in other cases, and which in a world with invisible law is what we run with. The development of U.S. gender asylum law tells a fascinating and different story of progressive legal change. We created this change by grounding the law and our advocacy in individual case representation, as well as by engaging in litigation and advocacy at higher levels. The traditional story of law and legal change is one of litigation or major legislation first, that then opens the door for change at the ground level. But ours is a grounds-up story. We now have a deep tradition of recognizing gender-based persecution and gender-based asylum claims, and this transformation of the law was brought about by representation of individual clients, advocacy with NGOs, people in government, and women in the media who highlighted the issues of fairness and equality central to gender asylum claims. If you use what you've been given, what's in front of you, and find the angle that could galvanize change, galvanize public opinion, advocates, and even the establishment, you can be the one to transform the law, whatever field you are in, to remedy injustices and bring about lasting change. Don't assume you have to start at the highest levels. Hierarchies can be reversed. Get down there, do the work, and start from the ground level. Changes come from insisting what should be right, should be reality, and making it happen. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Natasha Waraku from Harvard Graduate School of Education, better known as Hugsy for all those hugs they give over there in different ways. Yeah, woo, air hug. In different ways, each of her projects analyzes the cultural influences of the ways in which groups in society strive for status. She works at the intersection of race, immigration, culture, inequality, and education. She's the author of the award-winning book, Balancing Acts, Youth Culture in the Global City, and she's currently working on a book about undergraduates attending elite American and British universities. Anyone know of any elite American universities like that? And their understandings of diversity, multiculturalism, and inequality in society. Her talk tonight is called All Kids Want to Do Well in School.
that. Okay. The idea that I want to convey to you today is a simple one, that all kids want to learn. So I want to start out by having you put yourselves in my shoes. As a researcher in your average New York City public school, this is what I do for a living. So you walk in the front door, you show the security guard your ID, you sign in, and you walk in. Then you walk to the back entrance, and there you see a sea of faces, kind of like what I see right now, in a line running out the door. The bell rings, the late bell rings, but the line remains. Suddenly it feels like you're in an airport, about to board, because the line is for kids to pass their bodies through a metal detector and their bags through an x-ray machine, and you are already ready to go to the gate because adult visitors have special status in this school. You walk into a classroom where classes started, although there are just a handful of students in the classroom. Over the next 30 minutes, students slowly trickle in. And the teacher later explains to you that she doesn't mark those children late because she understands that they're getting held up by the security line. As the students walk in, they interrupt the lesson to say hello and good morning to their friends, and they give these seemingly requisite cheek kisses on the way in to all their friends. And it feels like they don't care. They've come in late. When they do come in, they interrupt the teacher to greet their friends. So what is going on here? So what I want to explain today is that all those kids care deeply about learning, but they also care about their friends. And just as they care about gaining academic status, they also care about peer status. And to kids, these goals are not mutually exclusive. But unfortunately, sometimes they don't see the ways in which privileging one over the other harms them. So if we as a society care about all kids, it's our job to ensure that they learn how to perform balancing acts, hence the title of my book, between their peer cultures and their desires for school success. So let's think about this question of peer status. So what gets kids peer status? I'm sure you all know this very well, better than I, having been closer to the teenage years than me. It's the clothes you wear, it's the music you listen to, it's the way you walk, the way you interact with your peers. It's defending your pride. And peer culture in schools is a complex social world that we all have navigated, some better than others. And while the details might be different in terms of what music and styles are hip across time and space, many elements of peer culture endure over time and in different social contexts. So we know music and style are always important, but what that is different. Defending one's pride is important. Most importantly, academic achievement does not factor into peer status. I've observed and interviewed hundreds of teenagers in schools, and very few have ever said that doing well in school affected their peer status for the worse. Let me read you a quote from a boy I called Joe. Joe is a child of immigrants from the Caribbean in New York, and he is kind of a self-described popular but low-achieving teen in New York. And this is what he said. He talked to me about how he went to Saturday school, which is remedial classes in his school. He said to me, the majority of popular kids, they put up a front like they're doing well in school, but the majority of them are doing bad. Like the ones you don't expect to see in Saturday school, they're the ones going. So you might be thinking, if all kids want to do well in school, why did I see those kids interrupting the teacher to greet their friends? Why did I so often see kids loitering in the halls well after the bell had rung? Why do so many kids get into fights when they know that getting into fights is going to lead them to get suspended from school? It's because they're all balancing this desire for school status with their desire for peer status. So when your school structure doesn't build in the time for you to connect with your peers, you find creative ways to do that. Stealing a morning kiss in the middle of class, loitering between classes to catch up on the latest gossip. And when peers tease you, you need to respond swiftly. And for boys, and a lot of times for girls, this ends up in the form of a fight. But these are not bad kids. Let me read you another quote, this time from a teenager I call Robert. Robert has an African-American father and an immigrant mother from the Caribbean. I had asked Robert if he'd ever been in a fight in high school since he started high school earlier in that school year. And this is what he told me. He said yes. And I asked him what happened, and he said, the kids were picking on me. I told the teacher, and the teacher didn't do anything. The next day, he was hitting me in class. So then after school, he was like, oh, we're going to fight now. And then I didn't do anything at first. I waited. like he hit me, and then I got up and I punched him in his face and his mouth was bleeding. I would never hit anybody just for hitting people's sake. I'll only do it to defend myself. Like, the result of that was that he stopped picking on me. Now, let me be clear. I think this is a terrible outcome. Schools need to figure out ways to create cultures that don't lead Robert down this path. And note that I started that sentence with schools, not with kids, because I firmly believe that there is much that schools can do to support teenagers like Robert, because all kids like Robert want to learn. So I'm going to offer you a few humble suggestions based on the research that I've done in schools. First, schools should promote decision-making skills, repeating mantras like, no fighting in school, without engaging students about how to avoid fighting while maintaining their pride will not get us anywhere. If we start from the assumption that Robert and kids like him want to do well in school and want to follow the rules, then we can think about helping him by both restructuring his school as well as helping him be more aware of the longer-term consequences of his actions in the heat of the moment. Second, schools should promote code switching skills. Here's Robert again. He said to me, I asked him if he ever changes the way he dresses, as the way he speaks in different environments. And he said, I do speak slang, but like, I know how to talk to people. Like how I'm talking to you right now, I don't talk to my friends like this. I would be like, oh, what's up, and all that. So more kids need to understand how to code switch like Robert, and both in terms of their language, but also between their youth culture and the adult academic culture of their schools. Third, we as adults have to engage youth cultures, because no matter what we do, school uniforms, banning headphones, banning cell phones, banning baggy pants, banning skinny jeans, whatever, it's going to be impossible for us to rid schools of youth culture among teenagers. But instead, educators can use it for good. So understanding teenagers' social and cultural worlds will allow teachers to connect more easily to their students. So John Dewey, over 100 years ago, wrote his famous book, Experience in Education, and he talked about how knowledge has to begin with an individual's life experience. And this hasn't changed. This is still true today. Fourth, school structures should foster strong relationships. I haven't mentioned that I've done this research with teenagers in London as well. And there, the norm is for students to follow the same homeroom class from class to class every year for 5 years in high school. Students stick with a group of peers they get to know well, and this facilitates lasting relationships, and they talked about this. They have multiple school-wide breaks for lunch, for snack, for morning homeroom, afternoon homeroom, and this provides a lot of downtime for students to engage in their peer social worlds, leaving the academic classes for academic work. It also allows them to bridge racial and ethnic differences because they get to know this group of peers that across racial and ethnic lines. A very different story in New York. So I want to remind you of my simple message that I started from: all kids want to learn. So sometimes people assume that minority kids in urban, low-performing schools don't, but they do. Whether they're poor, they're rich, in prison, in private school, in under-resourced public schools, Black, Native American, white, Asian, Latino, boys or girls, they want to learn. So when you see kids behaving in ways that undermine their school success, ask yourself, why? What is it about the school environment that's leading this child to that behavior? What competing interests is that child grappling with, and why did he or she feel compelled to enact the path that compromises that desire to learn? And the next time you hear a disparaging remark about how those kids don't want to learn, please remember this talk and remind that person that all kids want to learn. Thank you.
I love that you quoted John Dewey. He's a friend of mine. Not really, I mean, he's been dead for a while. But he had a great influence on Unitarian thought and was greatly influenced by Unitarian thought. So that makes him a friend of mine, since I'm a Unitarian studying to be a minister. Now we'll hear from Ann Forsyth from the Graduate School of Design. Trained in planning and architecture, Dr. Forsyth is a professor of urban planning and works on the social aspects of urban development. She researches the success of planned alternatives to sprawl, with particular attention to the tensions between social and ecological values in urban design. She's created a number of tools and methods in planning, including health impact assessments and participatory planning techniques, along with several new ways of understanding social and intellectual diversity in planning and design. The big issue behind her research is how to make more sustainable and healthy cities, and most of her work has been in suburbs. So tonight, she'll be speaking on the real problem of suburbs.
Gave you a preview. So tonight I'm going to talk about the real problem of suburbs. And for many people, it's exemplified by the image that you can see behind me. Low density, detached housing, probably in an automobile-oriented location, perhaps socially isolated. But my argument tonight is that the real problem of suburbs is much bigger and much more interesting than that. As the world adds 3 to 5 billion people in the next half century, most of that growth is going to happen in urban areas. And the part of the urban areas where that growth will happen is in suburbs. Of course, there'll be action happening in high-income countries where there'll be a bunch of redevelopment. But the real action in terms of urban growth is in the suburban parts of low and middle-income countries. I like to take the long view when looking at urbanization. This slide only looks at 300 years of estimated and projected growth, but it can give you some of the picture of worldwide population growth and urbanization. Going from 1900, when 15% of the world's population were urban, although many of those urban areas were quite small, a few thousand people, and where there were a small number of cities over 1 million, to today where there are 400 or 500 cities of 1 million or more, to the coming half century when that will increase even further. Of course, this will happen under each of the UN's population projections, high, medium, or low. Of course, that's a very global view of the world's population growth, and this growth actually happens in particular urban places. And this slide gives you one way of thinking about how interesting that urban growth is going to be. These are projections from the United Nations for cities over 750,000 people, and it shows the places that they think are currently the fastest growing places in the world. Sometimes with other audiences, I ask people to guess the country, but I know you're sophisticated and you'll recognize these places, and you'll know that they're not the global cities of much of the news media coverage, the command and control centers of the world economy, places like Sydney, Toronto, London, and Tokyo. They're also not the mega cities, the world's cities of 10 million or more, places like Mexico and Sao Paulo. Instead, there are a more diverse set of places, mostly in this case in China and, or in Asia and Africa. And of course, this is only a partial view of the complexity of urban growth. Many smaller cities are quite big enough to have suburbs. Many cities growing less fast are also going to have significant suburbanization. But it starts to show that the image in that first slide of North American suburbia is a limited one. Of course, that raises the issue of how I'm defining suburbs. And a couple of years back, I wrote an article where I analyzed the various definitions of suburbs that had been used over the past century or so. In fact, there were hundreds of them, but I found 10 big dimensions or themes that cut across each of those. They're up on the slide and you can read them, but I just want to give you a sense of the diversity. For instance, when I talk about built environment, the stereotype is of detached suburban houses, but in fact there are transit-oriented suburbs. When we think about activities, the classic idea is that suburbs are mostly residential, but there are many industrial suburbs and have been for over a century, and many of the places where the world's economy is expanding the most are in suburban places. And when you think about the social and cultural character of suburbs, there's an idea that they're middle class and white. But if you look at the statistics, even for the United States these days, there are more poor children in suburbs than in center cities. Having a range of dimensions to think about suburbanization allows one to analyze more systematically. And I just want to give you an example of one of these systematic analyses. These are two images of houses built in the suburban part of the New York metro area in the 1940s. At the top is a house in Levittown, a classic suburban environment, a tract development built on a large scale. On the bottom is Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, never seen as suburban in the architectural literature, but seen as a work of architecture. And when you look at them, they are quite different places. One for an elite person, an elite architect, another for a mass population. But they share many, many dimensions in common. Their location in New York, they are both detached houses, they're in automobile-dependent areas, they are primarily residential, and so on. And when you have a global view of the suburbs, what turns out to be the dimensions that are common across suburbs around the world are that they have outer location and relative newness. So it's about their period and their location. And outer location and relative newness bring a common set of problems around the world, even though the suburbs are very diverse, to do with access to services, new social networks, and infrastructure provision, among others. So let's just see suburbs like this low-income one in the United States, this high-density suburb in China, this multi-ethnic planned community in Sweden, this high-tech growth corridor in India, and this self-built housing in China as being all suburban environments. So a global view of suburbs that focuses on outer location and newness allows us to really see the challenge of coming urbanization. My other area of work is on health and urban planning, and from this perspective, this global suburban challenge raises a number of opportunities as well as problems. Suburban areas lack access to the opportunities of the core city. People are having to form new social groups and make social connections. On the other hand, you can often be close to green space and have housing that is of a higher quality than you could achieve other places. There are lots of strengths and weaknesses that are worthy of investigation. So, the real problem with suburbs is much more complex than the stereotype that you see in this image, and it's far more interesting.
Next up is Ahmed Regab from Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Regab, or rather Dr. Regab, holds both an MD from Cairo University in Egypt and a doctorate in the history and philosophy of science from one of France's most prestigious research universities. As a physician, historian, and scholar, Dr. Regab teaches at the intersection of science and religion. His work includes the history and development of medieval Islamic sciences, the relationship between science and religion in the medieval and modern Middle East, the history of medieval Islamic hospitals, and the intellectual and cultural history of women in the region. Tonight, his address is entitled Subversive Remembrance, New Histories of Self and Other.
Thank you for inviting me. I chose the weird title because it normally makes people a little bit curious. So, in a poem that a poet wrote to his lover, he was trying to tell him that he will always and always love him. Our poet was actually a poet living in Baghdad, in Abbasid Baghdad, in the beginning of the 9th century. His lover was in his late teens or early 20s, and he was getting really worried because signs of age were starting to show on him. He was starting to notice a lot of wrinkles in his face. His facial hair was becoming harder to get rid of. He was really feeling anxious, and he didn't want to lose his lover. His lover, our poet, was writing this poem to tell him that he will always remain committed to him. Today I stand among you to remember this story, the story of this poet and his lover, the story of their love and their commitment to each other, and the life that they shared together that a lot of people then, as some people now, thought that it was not possible or it was not right. Remembering in this situation becomes an act of subversion. It's a subversive act because it allows us to see that life is not always as we imagine it is. Because it allows us to see a different reality, a different world. It allows us to remember that there is a huge multiplicity of the human experience. We start to understand that things are not always like what we think. That what we believe is natural or normal or right is not necessarily so. It allows us also to see what is old, what is new, and what is newer than cell phones and the internet. By remembering, we allow ourselves to become alive by essentially airing all these memories that happened before us. In a way, it's really like a ghost story. It's like a horror movie, and the good part about a horror movie. It's like all these ghosts that keep chasing the hero of the story, the protagonist of the novel, or of this ghost story, until the story is told. When the story is told, the ghost goes away in the story. Here, when the story is told, they come to be alive. They join us in the multiplicity of our experience. Telling stories, which is really the core of the work of a historian, is not something that's new. It's actually something, one of the oldest professions, if you will, that people ever did. In any community, in any group of people, there was always someone who stood to tell the story, told the story of their own. This is a profession that was practiced by poets, shamans, priests. It was also the job that was practiced by grandfathers and grandmothers, telling the stories of their families and of their communities to the young, transmitting an experience. By telling the story, telling the story is an empowering act. It's an act that allows us to exist within ourselves, and that allows us in many cases to exist within the other. Telling the story is also an act of critique. It is not a way of presenting a history that has to be an example for us, that we have to imitate. It is not presenting a blueprint for the future. It's only telling us that things could be different, because they were different, because things are always different. It's a way of showing us the multiplicity of our experience as humans. For all of us today, working on charting some part of the human experience, whether as historians, as humanists, as social scientists, as biologists, as all sorts of scholars who try in many ways to chart some form of the life that we witness today in our world. For all of us, telling the story is a moral and an ethical commitment. Telling the story allows us to empower people. We inherit the job of others, of telling the story of our own. But our own do not have to be our races, do not have to be our families. They don't have to be of the same religion, sexuality, or gender. Our own could be the poor, the meek, the voiceless, the ones who failed or who were not able to get their stories across. It becomes part of our responsibility. Much like another graduate of this university, the first African-American doctoral graduate from this university, came to tell the story of his people in an act that was empowering, an act that allowed for a new life to come into this existence. Today, again, we go through the same process again and again. We are committed, we are morally and ethically committed to tell the stories and to give voice to those who do not have a voice. And this is what I came here to tell you today. Thank you.
Our last speaker for this segment is Tom Nichols from Harvard Extension School. Dr. Nichols is a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College, where he has also served as the chair of the strategy department. He also serves as a senior associate of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs in New York City. His most recent book is about nuclear weapons and is actually just about to hit the press. It's called No Use: Nuclear Weapons and the Reform of American Security Strategy. And fun fact, he's also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. Cool, right? Tonight, he'll be addressing the question, why do we study war?
Well, thank you for having me tonight. Some years ago, a colleague of mine from the War College, and by the way, obviously I'm not here speaking for the US government or Alex Trebek or anybody else. If the budget crisis goes on, I won't be speaking for anybody. But let's not open that can of worms. Some years ago, one of my colleagues from the War College went to see a singer who'd had some modest success in the 1970s. She was well known as a kind of a soft rock chanteuse, and she sang a few of her songs, and he met her afterwards, told her what a terrific singer he thought she was. And she said, well, that's wonderful. What do you do? And he said, well, I work at the Naval War College. And this silky-voiced singer suddenly turned into this hissing, angry mass, and she cursed him out in language I won't use on hollow ground. And she said, why don't you teach at a peace college? Well, it's a good question. Why is there a war college? Why do British universities have departments of war studies? It's an interesting problem because no other field of human endeavor prepares to engage in the thing it's trying to prevent at the same time. Police officers go to the police academy, and they study how to prevent crime. They don't also study how to become more effective muggers. They study how to arrest criminals. Firefighters study how to put out fires. They also don't take electives in effective arson 101. So it is, despite her anger and perhaps the inappropriateness of the way she put her question, our friend from soft rock history was asking a good question. Why do we study war? Why would we even make this properly the subject of any kind of intellectual inquiry at all? I would argue that the study of war is both a scholarly and a moral imperative. Some scholars study war merely as a detached phenomenon. They try to look at it as perhaps as a biologist looks at a particular species of animal. But I think that there is an inherently moral requirement in the study of war because it's very obvious that our preference is for peace. We study war specifically because it's something that repels us, something we find to be dysfunctional. We don't study it in a purely morally detached or scholarly way. I would argue that's impossible. Certainly people try, in the same way that for a while scholars tried to study different forms of government without having a particular prejudice for liberal democracy. And yet, every time scholars of democracy asked the question, they were really asking the question, why aren't other governments, why does totalitarianism even exist? Why do authoritarian governments abuse their people? Why aren't more countries liberal democracies? It's inherent in the nature of the problem. Now, I think, excuse me, partly the problem here is that war involves the very essential question of who we are, of why we do the things we do, of what it means to be a human being, because war involves the single most momentous thing that a human being can do. It involves taking the life of another human being intentionally. Sometimes it involves, as it did in the old days of war, loading a rifle as quickly as you could, picking another person out on the battlefield and killing them one-on-one. Sometimes it involves, potentially, if we're talking about nuclear weapons, the destruction of millions of human beings in a matter of minutes. Nonetheless, it always involves, when we are talking about war, and this is, by the way, why I don't like terms like cyber war or virtual war. War involves the taking of life. And if we begin from the assumption, as I hope we do, in almost any society, that human life is sacred, then we have to understand that we are embarking, when we study war, on something that has incredible political but also incredible moral and spiritual significance. We study war because we want to talk about peace. We study war in order to find peace. But we also study war because we're studying ourselves. War, like crime, like other human failings, tells us much about who we are. And I would argue that the people who study war have come to accept, unlike the folks, for example, right after World War I, who for a brief moment had the hope that somehow war could be eliminated, some kind of aberration. It was like polio, that if we could just figure out how it happens, we could kind of put it out of existence. People who study war now, we accept that it's not going to go away. But we also try to think about what is it in those moments when we may have to kill each other. How can we approach this without losing our basic humanity? I would argue that this is the question that has bedeviled scholars of military conflict and of violence in general since the beginning of time. Because there are times when it's necessary to take up arms, at the very least in self-defense. And at those moments, how do we engage, again, in this ultimate act of taking another human life, but without losing our own humanity, without mortgaging everything that we are as human beings in that moment? I would also argue that the rigorous study of war, as I wrote here, its causes, its conduct, although we can try to intellectualize the problem, the fact of the matter is it's always a tragedy. We celebrate victories, we hold parades, in fact, I was downstairs before this presentation began looking at some of the pictures, including a large gathering right here in front of Memorial Church on VE Day, where people gathered for prayer and thanksgiving. You've all, of course, seen the famous picture of the sailor kissing the girl in Times Square on VJ Day. And those are moments that rightly make us happy. Nonetheless, there has never been a war that is not a tragedy. And you could argue, I suppose, that people who study war are fascinated by it, and that's kind of puzzling. I'll plead guilty to that. I'm fascinated by war. I'm fascinated by war in the same way that an oncologist is fascinated by cancer. And every day that I study it and perhaps find a new type of it that can be cured, or its damage limited, its mortality rate cut, its baleful effects mitigated somehow, the quality of life of people who have to suffer through it somehow improved, I think all of those are worthy endeavors in the study of war. And I would end by telling you that the real reason we study war is because we still have hope. We study war because we still care. If we stop studying war, if we stop studying human conflict, if we stop studying the roots of organized violence between states, then we've lost hope. Then we've given up. And I refuse to give up. Thank you.
Now we'll hear from Nava Ashraf from the Business School. Dr. Ashraf is a professor of negotiations, organizations, and markets. Her research combines psychology and economics, using lab and field experiments to test insights from behavioral economics in the context of development projects in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Her experiments address behavior change in health and health services delivery, in agricultural production, and in microfinance. She has also conducted research on decision-making in the areas of finance and fertility, with a special focus on women's empowerment. Her talk tonight is called Harnessing Human Nature to Impact Global Health and Development.
I want you all to imagine a world in which you believe that self-interest, primarily defined as monetary gain, is the driving motivation of everyone you meet. Now I want you to imagine that this assumption becomes the core of a new discipline, which grew to dominate thinking in both the social sciences and spheres of government, and became what we teach to our business leaders. What kind of policies, institutions, and incentives would you create with this assumption at its heart? Now imagine that everyone believed that everyone is looking out for each other and for the collective, that what drove people is really the common fight, and what you need to count on is their willingness to help their brother and their comrade and not their own interest. What kinds of policies and institutions and incentives would you design? Would they work? And now, as a third path, take the assumption that we as human beings are imperfect, that we strive to love others and possibly work towards the common good and think sufficiently of the future, of our own, of our children's, and yet we regularly fall short of our goals. What happens when we seriously, rigorously consider the richness of human nature, both in the design of our thinking and acting in social and economic policy? So let's return to Adam Smith, who many consider the father of modern-day economics. These are his opening words of the theory of moral sentiments. How selfish soever a man may be, there are some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him. So economists over the last couple decades have really tried to say, what are these principles? How do we measure them? How important are they? And part of how people have looked at this is through experimental games. Maybe some of you have played this in your class, so think of the classic, what economists call the dictator game. It's actually to measure altruism. But you have $10, you can decide how much of that you want to give to a completely anonymous other in a one-shot transaction. Standard economic theory would say you give nothing and people instead give more than 50% of their endowment. How is that? How does that help us understand when monetary gain is the traditional assumption? And so you can see this. Later I'll show you about how how people play this game actually predicts how well they do in a service-oriented activity. So it's not trivial, the behavior in these games. But the regard for others and how much I care about others is one portion. The other one, which Adam Smith also talked about, is how I want to be regarded by others. In fact, Smith talked about it as the central force motivating even why we accumulate material possessions. It's the desire to be regarded well, to belong, to be included. And in fact, in certain experiments where people are actually excluded socially, and they do fMRI scans of their brain, social exclusion shows up in your brain like physical pain. That's how much it hurts. That's how hardwired it is in us. Those are the principles. So now, if we take that as an assumption of human nature and we say, this is part of who we are as humans, what should change about the way we want to structure work and compensation? And so here I'm going to show you a picture that is going to take you to a completely different world in Lusaka, Zambia, where I've been doing fieldwork for the past 7 years. This is from a clinic I work with, and this is your standard health interaction. And I call it the co-production of health because, of course, health and development aren't something we give people, they're something that people themselves produce, but interacting with what we might call supply-side factors. Here you see a nurse, it could be anything, of people who are delivering and distributing health services and products. But these supply-side factors, of course, have their own motivations. They are human just like everyone else. And what are the kinds of things that could motivate them? So take about one example that was happening in Zambia. So this is one of those products out there, health products. This is a female condom, the only way that women have to protect themselves against HIV. PSI, a social marketing firm in Zambia, was wondering how to best distribute this. We're looking for innovative distribution channels. There weren't enough nurses. You had to wait too long. How could you get this out there? They thought of hairdressers. And as we thought about hairdressers with them, they said, well, you know, we don't know what the right way is to motivate them. Should we motivate them like volunteers, with financial incentives, or in some other way that we designed, which is basically an aspect of social recognition. This was a thermometer they put up, they got stars. As the stars increased, you got a ceremony. It was a way to recognize and to help you see the contribution of your social impact. Imagine what happened. Contrary to their beliefs that unless you gave people, they were trying to apply private sector marketing things, unless you gave people a financial margin, they wouldn't have a mission. Instead, actually, what happened was that social recognition was twice as powerful as the financial margins and much more cost effective. This doesn't mean you have to pay people with stars. Absolutely not. They can't eat stars. It doesn't mean that people should be volunteers. It just means that there's a part of our nature that is filled with that. And that dictator game that I talked to you about at the beginning, if we did this with the 2,000 hairdressers that were part of our field experiment, and what we found is those who gave above median giving were actually much better at preventing HIV and promoting female condoms. And this harnessed basically that part of their human nature to promote health. So this is something that the government of Zambia, it's a country with 13 million people and 900 doctors. They've been trying to think, how do we use community health workers as a way? How do we motivate them? How do we bring out this part of people, but really use it on top of financial compensation, but with an eye towards this other part of our nature? So in the last part that I have with you, I want to actually talk to you about something that takes us far beyond health services. You think about services as in health or education or government. But what I call you to right now is to think about all work, doing all work in a spirit of service, what that would look like, whatever you're doing, and doing it in a spirit of service, creating a form of worship. I mean, it's very interesting that we're in Memorial Church right now. I thought about what does it mean, this is a quote from the Baha'i writings, that work done in the spirit of service is worship. It's similar to this poem by Khalil Gibran, who's a Lebanese poet, about work is love made visible. If you create that kind of love, that kind of devotion, what would happen to us if we create incentives and institutions, and I'm talking as a business school professor, that talks to us, to our highest angels? What could we accomplish?
I love that quote. I'm just going to read that back to you because I found that so powerful. Work done in the spirit of service is worship. I think I'm probably going to use that in a sermon. So next up, we're going to hear from John McDonough from the School of Public Health. Professor McDonough has a doctorate in public health from the University of Michigan, as well as a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School. Check this. Between 1985 and 1997, he was elected 6 times to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where he chaired the Joint Committee on Health Care. In 2006, he played a central role in Massachusetts health reform as the executive director of Healthcare for All, a leading health advocacy organization. Are you seeing a pattern here? From 2008 to 2010, he went on to work with the U.S. Senate on the Affordable Health Care Act. So he's going to tell us about the future of health reform. And whatever he says, I would believe him.
Hi. Forgive me, I find the eagle intimidating. So I'm here to talk for myself and to talk for the school I represent, the School of Public Health, and to talk for the profession, the discipline of public health, because this is U.S. Public Health Week. So bear with me. And my thesis is that the next challenge, the next stage, the next phase of health reform will involve public health and prevention, population health and wellness. That's what's coming. So this is just Public Health 101, a definition of public health. It's been around for a while. This is the core premise of the Harvard School of Public Health. Health is a fundamental human right, and public health's mission is to protect and enhance everyone's health all over the globe. But the reality is, this is U.S. Public Health Week, and how many of you knew it? Oh, 3. In fact, polls show that less than 3% of the U.S. population can explain what public health is. Most think it's government health care, government for poor people, and have a very difficult time explaining what the heck it is. So that's part of our challenge. But we have a good story to tell. This is by our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These are the 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century. It's an impressive list. Every one of them has data, but I didn't have space or time. I got 7 minutes here. I can't believe what Robert's doing to us all up here. This is the 20th century. Here's just the first 10 years of the 21st century. Some of the achievements of public health that we've already seen in this century, with so much more to come. But the challenges are greater. The challenges are getting more difficult. These are some of the dangers that we're facing. This is a list that's probably familiar to a lot of you, but here's just one statistic to keep in mind. Today, a Hispanic girl born in the United States has more than a 50% chance that she will develop diabetes over the course of her lifetime. And it is an entirely preventable disease. People think government public health agencies alone cannot solve the problem. This is not just about government. This is not just about what we call public health. Let me just show you one map that is particularly shocking. Can you see this map? You know the country we're talking about, right? You see all these red areas? All these red areas are parts of the United States of America where between 1987 and 2007, female life expectancy dropped. Negative. Look at that. I'm going to shut up for a second. Just contemplate it for a second. There are so many messages just from this to see. So many of the problems that we face, some of them are improving, some of them are getting worse. Here's an example of what we're up against. But in response to this, public health in the United States is changing. It is evolving. It is growing. We're probably seeing more evolution and change in the discipline, the practice, the method, the science of public health over the past decade than we've seen over the past 110 years in the United States. This is just some of the evolution, some of the growth, some of the development. Population health, the triple aim, health in all policies, health equities. All of these are the future directions and the energy and the spirit of public health that is coming to life and that is growing all the time to address these rapidly growing threats. And let me just talk briefly about a few of them. Something that very few people know about, but came out in 2011, the National Prevention Strategy, mandated by the Affordable Care Act, is the first time in the U.S. history that we've seen the federal government adopt a health in all policies approach. So sitting around the table creating this strategy was not just the Surgeon General, Regina Benjamin, and Health and Human Services. Sitting around the table were the federal departments of Education, Housing, Transportation, Homeland Security, the Attorney General, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Defense Department, the State Department, all of these agencies coming together to come up with a strategy for how we can begin to move ourselves from a healthcare system that takes care of people when they're sick to one that actually prevents disease. So that is one. Here's another one, health in all policies. Didn't really start in the United States, really began, the first nation to really adopt it broadly was Finland. But we're seeing it now happening. It's the part of the official health policy of the European Union. It is moving and gaining strength across the United States. We see it in different ways. An example of it would be something called safe and healthy homes. You know, if you go into a low-income home and you do weatherization in there, and that's all you do, you can save on energy, but you can also more effectively seal in the kinds of things that make kids sick, the kinds of things that result in exacerbated asthma, lead poisoning. If we go in and we do energy weatherization, at the same time we take care of the determinants of disease, we can actually have a win-win-win, and we can save money. So that's health in all policies. A third example, we're beginning to focus, for a variety of reasons, some just for necessity, on the return on investment from public health prevention. We can actually now, we are getting to the point where we are doing a much better job of documenting the economic case behind health promotion and disease prevention. $1 for poison control centers saves over $13. The Clean Air Act will save about $2 trillion in medical costs by 2020. HIV investments have saved more than 350,000 lives. Dental care costs are half as expensive in communities that have fluoridation. Diagnosis and treatment of prevention saves $7 for every dollar in costs. This is another example. This is from Don Berwick, who founded the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. It's called the Triple Aim. It wasn't done for public health. It was done to give direction and leadership to medical care. But the Triple Aim involves improving the patient experience of health, lowering per capita health costs, and improving population health improvement. So in the 1910s, we saw a split between medical care delivery and public health. Prior to the 20th century, they were a similar discipline. Public health and medical care were one and the same, and they split apart in the early part of the last century, and we're seeing them come back together in a way that holds great promise. So there's a new public health. There is a new public health that is taking root, that is growing in sophistication, in scope. We're dealing with enormous challenges in terms of financial resources being cut. Sequestration is devastating budgets in the Centers for Disease Control and in state and local health departments. But the system itself is getting smarter, more sophisticated, and better. And that's why my premise is that this is going to be, in spite of our setbacks right now, this is going to be the century for prevention and public health in the United States. Thank you. How bad was I?
Now that we've heard about the future of healthcare, we're going to talk more specifically about the transforming role of philanthropy in science. We're going to be hearing from Bruce Walker from the medical school. Dr. Walker is an infectious disease specialist whose research focuses on cellular responses to HIV and how some rare people who are infected with the virus but have never been treated can actually fight it off with their immune system. He's the director of the Ragon Institute of MGH, MIT, and Harvard, which seeks to understand HIV and how to treat it. But that's just his day job. Somehow he also finds time to teach on the other side of the world at the Nelson Mandela School of Medicine in South Africa, where he helps train African scientists and is on the steering committee of an initiative there to build an HIV research facility.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to talk to you today. I'm a physician. I went to medical school really with one goal in mind. I was going to take care of patients. And I was incredibly excited when I got my first job out of medical school as an intern at Mass General Hospital, where I thought I would be learning from the best doctors in the world, and was really delighted to find that to be the case when I got there. And then something very strange happened. A patient came into the emergency room with a disease that none of us had ever seen before. The smartest doctors there were unable to come up with an explanation for why this young man suddenly seemed to have completely lost his ability to fight off infections. And that basically, basically the conclusion was this is probably something we'll never see again. It's some aberrant something or other. Don't worry about it. The patient rapidly died, and then 2 weeks later, we saw the exact same thing again. And to those of us on the front lines, it was very clear at that moment that this was a new disease, that this was a really deadly disease, and that we had nothing in our arsenal to be able to take care of it. At that point, I decided that really, if we didn't, as physicians, begin to do research and try and learn from our patients, we were going to have very little to offer them. So I became not just a clinician, but I also became a scientist, and I started working on this new disease, which was called AIDS. Quickly, it became clear what the cause of this was, a virus called HIV. And the reason that people were as sick as they were was because it was an infection of the immune system. We're now 30 years into that epidemic, and sadly, we still don't have a way to prevent people from becoming infected. We've made incredible advances in terms of medications to treat the infection, but a vaccine, which is designed to basically get the body to fight off the infection before it ever takes hold, is something that's still elusive to us. The problem with medications is that they are required for lifelong in people that are HIV infected. Once one becomes infected, the virus becomes a part of the person, and the medications we have won't eliminate it, so you're faced with a lifelong requirement to take medications. And worldwide, for every patient that we've been able to put on therapy, 2 new people have become infected. So to me, what that says is that the only solution to this problem is going to be the development of a vaccine which will prevent people from becoming infected. And as I've continued and spent my entire career working on this epidemic and trying to understand how the body fights HIV and why it loses that battle, my emerging view is really that we're never going to solve this problem the way that we're doing it. Science exists in silos. Scientists in different groups don't really speak to one another. Scientists are out there, are willing to be engaged, but we have funding mechanisms that prevent that from happening. If you're not already a card-carrying HIV researcher, your chances of actually breaking into the funding mechanisms and being able to bring your ideas and your knowledge to that field is really quite small. As a result, we really have not yet applied the full scientific toolbox to this problem. And in addition to that, because of the way funding is set up, as funding gets tight, creativity and innovation are the first things to go. What gets funded are the things that are the sure bets, and the really innovative ideas that might really be transformative become the things that actually don't make the grade in terms of funding. So, so I've continued to work on HIV my entire career. Along the way, we started asking questions about the epidemic in Africa and got involved there. And that's where philanthropy first came in for us. We had the idea that if we could understand why children do worse than adults, we might be able to make some headway. Somebody had given us a donation that allowed us to buy a plane ticket to go over to South Africa to basically establish some collaborations. Initially, we thought we'll go there and then we'll bring specimens back. We realized when we got there were people that wanted to work on the problem that weren't allowed to, that weren't able to because of a lack of scientific resources and research capacity. So we started actually a program to try and do something about that. And through additional philanthropy, we're able to build a biomedical research institute in the center of the HIV epidemic and began to, at the same time, address issues in terms of the fact that at that time people were not able to access medications to treat HIV infection. We started a pilot treatment program. We got very engaged with the South African government, and as the government then finally decided that they were going to treat people who were HIV infected, we actually consulted with the government to help set up those programs. One of the places that we worked was at a mission hospital called McCord Hospital, and there they have an electronic medical record. And as this was going along and as the patients were being taken care of and there was a bigger and bigger effort there, what we realized was that they had this electronic medical record that would allow for allow them to take care of these patients. And the detail person there kept asking me if I would meet with him, the person that basically was the representative for the company for this electronic medical record. I put him off for about a year thinking that he wanted to sell me software, and then in the end, the superintendent said, please meet with him, he just wants to ask you a question. And the question was, would I meet with the owner of this electronic medical record and tell him that it was saving patients' lives so that he wouldn't pull the company out of South Africa? Well, I met with this person. It turned out he lived in Boston, and he basically told him what we were doing. He sounded very interested, asked a lot of questions, and finally said, I'd like to come and see what's going on there. He came over, looked at what we were doing, and we showed him the variety of different things that we were doing in terms of teaching life skills to kids through soccer and working with orphan-led households and a variety of other things that were mission creep beyond our immunologic investigations. And finally, after 3 days there, as we were driving him back to the airport, he said, boy, I don't see how anybody could ever see what I've just seen and not want to get involved, but I'm sure you have all the funding you need from the government. What could I possibly do? Well, at that point, we said, let's explain how this actually works, that in fact the funding mechanisms aren't aligned. And so at the airport, I said to him, well, you know, if you were willing to give us $4,000, we'd buy a machine that would work in the lab to help us do specific assays. If we had $10,000, we'd hire a nurse. If we had $100,000, we would start a new project trying to understand a particular part of the immune system. But what I'd really like to do is have a chance to solve this epidemic, and I don't think we'll ever have a chance to do that the way we're going about it, and then explain to him these issues about how the incentives weren't aligned. Well, over the course of the following year, he kept asking me about that idea, and in my own mind, it kind of gelled a little bit more in thinking that if we could just bring together the people of Harvard and MIT and bring people from other disciplines into the HIV field, we could really accelerate research. So he basically, over the course of the year, we spoke about this about 4 different times, and he then came to my office one day asking me about this, to tell him about this idea again, and I started to explain it to him, and he interrupted me and said, let me see if I understand this correctly. It sounds like you think this could be a solvable problem, but we're not solving it the way we're going about it, and that you need long-term investment to bring other people in, and it sounds to me like you need about $10 million a year for about 10 years. And I said, yeah, that sounds about right. And he said, well, my wife and I would like to do that. And Terry and Susan Reagan gave us $10 million a year for 10 years to spend on bringing other scientists from Harvard and MIT to work on the HIV epidemic to try and come up with solutions. The mission of this, the vision of this institute is to harness the immune system to prevent and cure disease. Doesn't say anything about HIV, but our initial goal is to develop an HIV vaccine with the belief that whatever we do working on HIV will actually be broadly applicable to other diseases where the immune system plays a role, like prostate cancer and breast cancer and the like. So here we are in the Institute was established in 2009. Here we are in 2013. The model's working. We've been able to bring people in from other fields, geneticists and computational biologists that have helped us understand why some people can control HIV without ever taking any medications. Statistical physicists and people involved in stock market analysis that have helped us to understand vulnerable regions of HIV that can be the target for a vaccine. And engineers who have been developing new mechanisms to make vaccines that allow us now to target these vulnerable regions. And all of this is a result of philanthropy. It's the result of people that, a person in the beginning that gave us a plane ticket to go to South Africa. We leveraged that to be able to build a research institute. It came from Terry and Susan Reagan that allowed us to create an environment in Boston here where we can bring together the best minds to try and work on what is really a huge problem. The knowledge that we're creating, I think, will go far beyond what we've done with HIV. I think the lessons learned from this whole experience, and the reason I wanted to share this story tonight, is that I think it's really important that we allow ourselves to set a big vision. I had no sense that this person, Terry Reagan, had any ability to give us the kind of funding that would have been necessary for this pie-in-the-sky idea that I presented to him. But in fact, he was willing, and that's the second lesson, which is don't just have a vision, but be willing to express that vision. And then finally, I think we have to work collaboratively, and we have to work across disciplines if we're really going to accelerate discovery. My feeling is HIV is a solvable problem, and my feeling is that the people in this city at Harvard, MIT, and the other institutions have what it takes to actually solve the problem. We just need to give them the mechanisms to do that. Thanks very much.
Next up is Stuart Schreiber from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Schreiber is the Director of Chemical Biology at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, which is a new kind of research institute with a deeply collaborative spirit across disciplines and organizations that seeks to accelerate the understanding and treatment of disease through systemic approaches in the biological sciences. Dr. Schreiber is known for having developed systemic ways to explore biology, especially disease biology, using molecules, and for his role in the development of the field of chemical biology. Tonight, he'll be speaking on patient-based drug discovery.
Chris, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. The big idea that I'd like to share with you today concerns the way that we might discover safe, new therapeutics or medicines in the future. And there are two parts to my idea. The first is that in order to gain the information needed to make effective solutions to disease, to cure, treat disease, we need to learn from patients, what I've called human biology here. And the second is that we're going to have to innovate in chemistry and chemical biology in order to achieve success. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you would think, this can't be a big idea, a new idea. This is so obvious. But the reality is, it's not how drugs are discovered today. The two primary means of discovering drugs are outlined on this slide: compound-based and target-based drug discovery. Compound-based drug discovery is very opportunistic. It's where it all started. It's always the chance discovery of some biologically active substance, in this case, like Fleming's discovery of penicillin, which is followed by a search for a relevant disease. This opportunistic approach is surprisingly still a very common and dominant one today. The second approach, target-based drug discovery, came about with the advent of molecular biology and recombinant DNA, which allowed scientists for the first time to make any human protein in a test tube. And so now the idea is simply find the right protein. I've shown you the Lyme disease protein as the therapeutic target, make a drug against it, and usually about 15, 16, 17 years later, test the original hypothesis that that is the therapeutic target. So here's the problem. Not even discussing all of the failures that get up to the point of human clinical investigation to test the hypothesis. If we just look at the cases where clinical investigation proceeded, 97% of the time the approach fails. And there are two major failure modes. One is the compounds hit their target, but they have no efficacy. They don't make the patient any better. The second one, maybe it helps a little bit, but there's some unexpected toxicity somewhere else in the body. So the conclusion is that we're not very good at picking therapeutic targets. And how do we pick the therapeutic target? Well, we do experiments in test tubes, or we look at cells, or we look at what are called model organisms. So the idea is instead to turn to human biology, to look at the patients themselves. So even though we don't know exactly where to aim, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic today about learning from patients. The next problem we have is that in the cases we've looked at thus far, when you learn from patients, you find new therapeutic targets, but they're not targets that are familiar to the drug discovery process. And the experts are apt to tell you that the target is not what they would say druggable. But new advances in next generation of chemistry are beginning to address this problem. So here's the idea. We start with patients. We look at their genes, and we can sequence genomes with extraordinary efficiency today. Because if we look at patients that have disease and don't have a disease and look at the difference in the genetic variation, we can learn from these experiments of nature. What are the perturbations that are safe? What are the perturbations that are causal for disease? Then we put the genes on pathways, we model the defect, and then next we repair the defect. And here's where this next generation chemistry plays a key role. So following on Bruce's discussion, this is a very new approach, but there's one or two examples to keep us encouraged. One is in HIV. Very astute physician scientists a number of years ago noticed that a small number of high-risk persons were not getting HIV, were not being infected by HIV, not getting AIDS. Looking at their genomes and reading out their DNA, it became clear that this 1% of our population are immune to HIV infection. And these individuals have an alteration in a gene called CCR5. Luckily, that gene makes a protein that's called a GPCR. Half the drugs today target this family of proteins. This is an eminently druggable target. And a pharmaceutical company followed up on this and made a drug, the little white circle, that binds the protein that's present in 99% of us, making it harder for the HIV to infect cells because the gene that was identified encodes a protein that HIV uses to infect cells. So that's the good news, but here's the bad news. Many academics, especially in this Boston community, are discovering the root cause of disease by looking at human genomes and genetic variation. And their excitement about having an impact on human health is met often with this disconnect where the experts say, sorry, your gene, it could be what's called a transcription factor or a regulatory RNA, unfamiliar to the drug discovery process. It's not druggable. So, I believe that this word undruggable just means we haven't learned how to do it. I like the attitude of Muhammad Ali taking on Sonny Liston here. I work at the Broad Institute, a collaboration like the Reagan Institute between Harvard and MIT, and we're using this integration of human biology and next-generation chemistry, and we're really encouraged by some of the most daunting problems in human health today, like diseases of the brain, neurodegeneration, psychiatric disease, finding relevant targets, finding precursors to therapeutics, modulating things that previously were considered undruggable. So, human biology, human genetics, is identifying disease targets that are the causal ones for the first time. This doesn't guarantee success because the experts may say, stop, you're off the mark, you're not going to hit the mark because it's not druggable, or we might try to find some workaround. The big idea is to be disciplined, learn from human biology, and learn to develop the chemistry and chemical biology that allows us to hit those targets. A lot of progress being made, a lot of reasons to be optimistic, as long as we continue to advance this science of therapeutics. And that's my big idea for you. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Bjorn Olsen from the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. Our final speaker for this evening, Dr. Donnie Ham from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, was unfortunately unable to make it because he fell ill today. So Bjorn Olsen will be our last speaker this evening. He's another doctor. He holds both an MD and a PhD from the University of Oslo in Norway, where he began his teaching career. He then came to the US for further training and research in extracellular matrix biology. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what that is, but it sounds really impressive, right? He first came to Harvard in 1985 to teach at the medical school, and over the past 15 years, he's been instrumental in building a strong interdisciplinary research program in skeletal biology at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. His research utilizes experimental approaches of human and mouse genetics, cell developmental, and molecular biology to address skeletal and vascular disease-related problems. His talk tonight is about bone and blood vessels gone haywire.
So I'm going to tell you a story that shows you what one can really learn from patients with terrible diseases. And secondly, by studying different disorders, one can get at surprisingly common disease mechanisms. Mechanisms that could be targeted for therapy using the ideas that we heard in the previous talk. Now, the research behind this story is based on two concepts or principles. One principle is that one can learn quite a bit from studying very rare disorders. And this was realized by William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood 350 years ago. He stressed the importance of looking at nature, where she shows traces of her workings apart from the beaten path, the rare event. The second concept behind this research is that if you get to a fork in the road, take it. Translated, it means do not follow one path, but two or three or several paths. Because by following different paths in pursuit of disease mechanisms at the same time, you might have some very big surprises in store. And this story shows that. The story starts with a boy, Harry Eastlake, who was fine at birth, except for a deviated big toe. Big deal? No, not a big deal. He was a healthy boy until he was 10. At 10, he started to note bony nodules in his neck and the shoulders. Not in the bone, but in the muscles and the soft tissue in the neck and the shoulders. And when these nodules were removed by a careful surgeon, more nodules came. In fact, the removal of these nodules stimulated the formation of more bone in the wrong place, in the muscles and the soft tissues. And that was the beginning of a life by which, over time, Harry developed his own prison. He turned into a twisted marble-like stature, like Gregor Samsa in Kafka's Die Verwandlung. He got a shield of bone under his skin, on his back. All his muscles and tendons that connect the bones and allow mobility in the skeleton froze because they were converted into bone, like a metamorphosis. And at the end, at age 39, he died. He could only move his lips. His jaws were frozen in space. And he dedicated his double skeleton, or his skeletons, to the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, where you can now see his body, as you see on the right. Now, is Harry alone? No. There are thousands. How many thousands, we don't know, of individuals on this earth with this disorder. And this is a metamorphosis of skeletal muscles and soft tissues into bone. It's called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, or FOP. And a few years ago, a group in Philadelphia, Shore and et al., published a paper showing that individuals with this disorder, they have a very simple mutation. They have a single amino acid in the cell surface receptor called ALK2, arginine, replaced by histidine. And this mutation in one of the two copies of the gene for ALK2 is by itself not sufficient to cause the disorder. However, following a vaccination, little needle stick, or a visit to the dentist is sufficient to create a very low level of inflammation that, combined with a mutation, induces bone formation where bone is not supposed to be. So one of the postdocs in my lab, Damien Medici, and I, we asked, where do the cells that form the bone in the wrong place come from? And we were very surprised to find that the cells that form this bone are the cells that line the inside of blood vessels, endothelial cells, in capillaries, as you can see here. These are the cells that, in the presence of this mutation and factors produced by the inflammation, they change, they take on new properties, they start migrating, they become stem-like. And in the areas of muscles and soft tissues of these patients, these stem-like cells coming from the capillaries, the blood vessels of the muscle, form bone. They become like bone-forming cells. So the target for therapy here is not the bone, but it's the blood vessels being converted to stem-like cells. And obviously, to understand more about this process and develop strategies for therapy to prevent this terrible fate of these patients, one has to understand what is it that tells endothelial cells in capillaries to become stem-like cells. And now comes the big surprise, because we realized that we had been working at the same time with another disorder, more common, which includes the same event, endothelial cells becoming stem-like cells. This is the disorder, and this is the most common tumor in childhood. It's more frequent in girls than in boys. It's localized. 70% of the tumors grow from the neck and up. And they grow very rapidly after birth for about a year or less. And then, remarkably, they stop growing and they involute, they disappear. And as you can see from the girl on the right, she had a growing tumor soon after birth. At 6 years of age, you could see traces or indicating that the tumor is on the way out. And as a 17-year-old girl, she was a beautiful girl, no trace of the tumor. So what we have found is that these tumors grow for a very specific region, and the mechanism by which they grow contains the seeds for the tumor's disappearance. And in the disappearance of these tumors, the endothelial cells that form the tumor are replaced by fat cells. And lo and behold, it turns out that these fat cells are the tumor endothelial cells that have converted to stem-like cells and fat cells, just like in FOP. In FOP, this endothelial to mesenchymal transition, or NDMT, leads to the disorder because the stem-like cells from endothelial cells become osteoblasts, or bone-forming cells. In hemangioma involution, this process of NDMT resolves the disease. It cures the disease, gets rid of the tumors. And obviously what we would like to do is to be able to understand how to control this conversion of blood vessel lining cells to stem-like cells, to prevent this from happening in FOP patients. And by inducing the process at an early stage in a growing tumor in a baby, perhaps we can induce involution earlier. And perhaps even in malignant tumors that grow because they attract blood vessels ingrowth, if we can convert those vessel endothelial cells to fat cells, perhaps that would prevent the growth of malignant tumors as well. Now, is this a process that is only seen in disease? No. All of us, when our hearts developed, the lining endothelial cells of the heart tube go through the same process to produce what is called the cardiac jelly and the cells that form our heart valves. So our bodies know how to control this process. And our hope is that by learning about this process in detail, we should be able to control this, prevent FOP, induce premature or early involution of infantile hemangiomas, and perhaps use the process to produce bone where bone is missing in patients. Thank you.
Now we'll have one more performance by Melissa Hooser. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm so glad you all came to this interdisciplinary event brought to you by the Harvard Graduate Council. All of our student-nominated speakers tonight, as you've seen, are doing important work at the intersection of several disciplines. We hope you've been inspired to make connections between ideas tonight and to make connections with your fellow students from some of the other graduate schools. We hope you'll continue engaging one another in conversation about what you've heard here and throughout your studies, and that you'll go on to do great interdisciplinary work of your own. It's not often that we have an opportunity to gather like this from across the university, but there are many day-to-day opportunities for the cross-pollination of ideas at Harvard, and we hope you'll seek them out. We encourage you to check out classes and events and meet people at the other Harvard graduate schools, because after all, together, we are one graduate community. Together, we are one Harvard. Thank you for coming to One Harvard Lectures That Last. Special thanks goes out again to our generous sponsors, the Harvard University Employees Credit Union, Citibank, Brattle Street Florist, and Obon Pan for making this event possible. And now we're gonna do our raffles. Unless y'all don't want prizes. All right, first up, we're going to do the Harvard University Employees Credit Union. We're going to be drawing 2 tickets. So get out your cards, get ready. Doug Rhodes, are you here? If not, we'll pull again. And Jeff Siegel. Woo! Yeah, you did it, man.
We're just going to do the 2.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. And if you're heading out, please do take a moment to check out the artwork in the gallery to your right. All right. And now we're going to do our raffle from Citibank.
All right. We're giving out 2 pair of tickets to see Peter Pan at City Performing Arts Center. Good luck.
And the winner is James Gutierrez. And the second will be Jeremy Duchin. Either of you here?
No, keep going.
Yeah, I guess we'll do another. David Niemer, how about you?
Wow.
More chances to win.
Want to be here whole night?
Ahmed Abdel Wahab. We'll just keep drawing until somebody wins. Emily Mulliman. I can't quite make out the last name here, but Buyang.
This is the winner.
Last name? Katie nah, got it right. Neater, folks.
Can't tell, right?
If your name is Katie, just come on up. Yeah? Woo! Woohoo! Now we know to do the raffle at the beginning next year.
The next pair.
We have another pair, so we get to just keep drawing.
No, just.
Vernon Schmidt.
I got to pick a final one. Here's not, and that's.
Eeny, miny, mo is going to be next. James Lawson.
Oh, come on. They're all left.
Woo! Congratulations, James.
Great. Which one? James?
Yeah.
This one, right?
All right. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Have a great night.